In 2008, the American housing market didn't just stumble, it collapsed. Banks toppled like dominoes. Jobs vanished overnight. Millions of families were forced out of homes they believed would anchor their lives. It was the single most catastrophic housing meltdown in modern history. And for the generation graduating into that world, the ground beneath their feet was already gone. But what came afterward was even stranger. Instead of homes becoming cheaper, instead of affordability returning, instead of the market resetting the way every textbook said it should, something else happened. Homes became more expensive, much more expensive, to the point where the average millennial today would need decades just to save for a basic down payment in many parts of the country. And somehow, despite entering adulthood during the worst economic disaster in half a century, despite being weighed down by student loans, wage stagnation, and rising living costs, millennials were blamed for breaking the housing market. Not because they bought too many homes, but because they didn't buy any, because they waited, because their lives' timing didn't line up with the economy's. But that simple delay, a delay forced on them by circumstances outside their control, created a rare opening in the housing market. And the largest financial forces in the world saw that opening long before millennials ever knew it existed. While millennials were trying to rebuild their lives after the recession, paying down debt, scraping together savings in an economy that gave them little room to breathe, something was happening in the shadows. Wall Street was preparing to buy the American dream, not metaphorically, literally. Large financial firms with billions in capital realized something profound. If millennials weren't buying homes, those homes could be purchased by someone else, not to live in, but to rent back to the very people who couldn't afford to buy them. Homes stopped being shelter. They became financial instruments, revenue streams, portfolio stabilizers, hedgeable assets. Once housing became an investment product instead of a human necessity, everything changed. For decades, the average first-time homebuyer in the U.S. was 26 to 28 years old. Millennials broke that pattern. By 2015, the average millennial first-time buyer was 34. That 8-year delay didn't just shift the market, it rewired it. Into that delay stepped hedge funds, real estate trusts, private equity firms, corporate landlords, ready to buy entire neighborhoods at a time. They didn't use mortgages, they didn't negotiate, they didn't wait for approvals. They arrived with cash, full cash, and bought homes before normal families even had the chance to schedule a showing. A millennial couple offering $380,000 with a mortgage approval letter was no match for a hedge fund offering $410,000 in cash, sight unseen. And it didn't matter that the hedge fund was overpaying. They weren't buying a place to live, they were buying a revenue machine. A house to them wasn't a home. It was a line item, rent collected monthly, appreciation collected yearly, tax advantages collected forever. Between 2010 and 2022, billions of dollars of American housing transferred into corporate ownership. In some metro areas, as many as 40% of all starter homes were purchased by institutional investors. Entire communities that once belonged to families became rental portfolios. The generation blamed for breaking the housing market was also the generation priced out of the inventory their parents once took for granted. But the corporate takeover wasn't the only force reshaping housing. At the same time, Wall Street was buying the suburbs. Another phenomenon was consuming the cities, short-term rentals. What started as a simple idea, rent a spare room to make extra money, transformed into a large-scale housing extraction engine. Investors realized they could buy a home, remove it from the long-term housing supply, and earn 2 or 3 times the income by turning it into a short-term rental. Entire buildings became micro-hotels. Entire neighborhoods became weekend destinations. Entire zip codes transformed into commercialized tourism hubs. Every home converted into a short-term rental was one less home available for a family, one less starter home, one less affordable option. Between 2012 and 2020, short-term rental listings exploded by hundreds of % in many major cities. Millennials didn't create that wave, but their inability to buy allowed others to seize the opportunity first. Beneath it all was an even deeper, slower problem, the one that set the stage decades earlier. America wasn't building enough homes, not in the 90s, not in the 2000s, not even close. Zoning laws kept neighborhoods frozen, cities resisted density, construction lagged behind population growth. From 2008 to 2020, the United States underbuilt more than 6 million homes. So even if millennials had wanted to buy in the traditional window, there simply weren't enough homes to go around. Too few houses, too many buyers, too much competition. Prices rose, wages didn't. and the entry point into the housing market moved further and further out of reach. Then came COVID-19, the accelerant that ignited everything at once. What should have triggered a housing crash became the largest housing boom in modern American history. Interest rates fell to near zero. Remote work decoupled people from their cities. Families fled apartments for space. Investors saw opportunity everywhere. The result was chaos. Homes sold within hours. Bidding wars became normal. Offers came in from people who had never even visited the state. Inspection contingencies were waived, appraisals ignored. Buyers offered $50, $100, sometimes $200,000 over asking just to beat invisible competition. Millennials weren't just trying to buy a home. They were trying to buy one during the most aggressive, distorted, fast-moving housing surge in modern history. They were competing against remote tech workers from wealthy coastal cities, institutional investors armed with algorithms, Airbnb operators expanding portfolios, out-of-state buyers who could outbid local families without blinking. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even a fight. It was a feeding frenzy, and millennials were the smallest sharks in the water. For many, the experience was emotionally crushing. Homeownership wasn't just expensive, it felt impossible. They weren't losing to another couple. They were losing to forces far bigger than themselves. Corporations with endless capital, investors with algorithmic bidding tools, wealthier transplants with remote jobs, a system that prioritized return on investment over human stability. In some cities, nearly half of all first-time buyers needed help from family just to enter the market. This wasn't a millennial problem. It was a structural failure, a system designed for a world that no longer exists, colliding with a generation that never had the foundation previous generations enjoyed. So when people ask, did millennials break the housing market? The answer is simple: no. The housing market was broken long before they arrived. The timing of their adulthood, delayed by recession, debt, stagnation, opened a door that allowed private equity firms, corporate landlords, short-term rental operators, and remote worker demand to transform housing into a high-yield investment class. Millennials didn't break the system. They revealed it. But the consequences didn't stop with them. They're being inherited by the next generation, Generation Z. Gen Z isn't entering the market millennials faced. They're entering a market shaped by everything that's happened since. Years of underbuilding, years of investor dominance, years of prices surging faster than wages, years of homes being diverted into short-term rentals, years of remote work reshaping demand. Gen Z is stepping into a market where housing isn't just expensive, it's structurally inaccessible. The starter home, the foundation of middle-class stability for nearly a century, is disappearing. Not metaphorically, literally. Fewer starter homes are being built. Older ones are being bought by investors and rented out indefinitely. Young people are being funneled into permanent renting, not as a choice, but as a default. Gen Z will compete with millennials who still haven't bought, boomers who can pay in cash, institutional investors buying 20 houses at a time, Airbnb operators treating neighborhoods like profit engines, remote workers outbidding locals without effort. Behind it all is the same fundamental truth: America does not build enough homes for the people who need them. It hasn't for decades. Without massive construction, pressure on young buyers intensifies. Without zoning reform, markets stay frozen. Without limits on institutional buying, prices remain inflated. Gen Z faces a world where the baseline price is already inflated, where investors hold dominant positions, where underbuilding has created multi-million unit shortages, where interest rate cycles create waves of temporary opportunity that vanish as quickly as they appear. Buying a home won't just be expensive. It'll demand strategy, timing, luck, and often help from family wealth. Those who don't have that help will face longer timelines, heavier burdens, fewer options. This generational divide will widen inequality. Homeowners' wealth will multiply simply by existing in the system. Renters will pay more over time with nothing to show. The wealth gap will grow, not because of work ethic or discipline, but because of who could buy when the window was open and who couldn't. Housing isn't just economics. It's psychological. It shapes how people see their future. When you can't afford to live where you work, communities weaken. When you can't buy a home, family formation delays or disappears. When housing becomes speculative, stability vanishes. When investors own starter homes, upward mobility stalls. When young people can't root themselves, they stop believing the system will work for them. Stability becomes optional. Security becomes a luxury. For generations, the starter home was the first step towards stability. It was how families built wealth, how neighborhoods formed, how people rooted themselves. Millennials were the first to see that ladder pulled away. Gen Z may grow up in a world where the ladder doesn't exist at all. This crisis reshapes identities, hopes, and expectations. It reshapes what adulthood looks like, what adulthood feels like, what adulthood means. This crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It was decades in the making, the culmination of structural forces that collided at the exact moment millennials stepped into adulthood. It started with zoning laws drafted generations ago, laws designed for a world that no longer exists. Laws that banned duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, affordable multi-unit buildings across vast swaths of American cities, locking neighborhoods into low-density patterns. Then came local resistance. Every proposal for new housing met objections: too tall, too dense, too disruptive, too car-heavy, too many renters, too much change. City after city caved. Growth slowed to a crawl. Decades passed. Populations rose. Job centers expanded. But the number of homes barely moved. Supply slipped further behind demand every single year. Then came the financialization of housing, slow at first, then all at once. Investors realized homes were safer than stocks, more predictable than bonds, more lucrative than almost any other asset. Once they realized that, they flooded in, buying at scale, buying in cash, buying faster than families could ever save. Buying with global capital behind them, the average person simply couldn't compete. And then, just as millennials were finally old enough and stable enough to buy, the world changed again. Remote work decoupled people from their local markets. Suddenly, someone living in San Francisco could bid on a home in Phoenix. Someone from Boston could outbid every local buyer in Tampa. Someone from Seattle could buy in Austin. Work no longer anchored people to place. Place followed work. Housing pressure in expensive coastal cities spilled across the country, overwhelming local income levels in places that had never seen this kind of competition before. And then came short-term rentals. What started as a clever side hustle became one of the most powerful forces draining supply from long-term renters and first-time buyers. In some cities, entire floors of apartment buildings were quietly converted into short-term rentals. Homes that once housed families became weekend properties. Investors realized renting to tourists was far more profitable than renting to residents, and acted accordingly. Neighborhoods once rooted in tradition became revolving doors. Cleaning crews, rotating guests, no long-term residents. Each home converted was another unit removed from the housing ecosystem, another home unavailable to a young couple, another path to stability erased. These forces collided like tectonic plates, forming the crisis millennials walked into and Gen Z is now standing on. But the most painful part of this story isn't the financialization or investor takeover. It's the loss of something far more fundamental, the expectation that owning a home is part of a normal life. For more generations, the starter home was the first step toward middle-class stability. It was how families built wealth, how neighborhoods formed, how people rooted themselves. Millennials were the first to see that ladder pulled away. Gen Z may grow up in a world where the ladder doesn't exist at all. For Gen Z, the consequences ripple far beyond housing. When you can't buy a home, you delay marriage, delay children, delay stability, delay generational wealth, delay milestones. Society still says you're supposed to achieve, but no longer gives you the structure to reach. As long as homes remain scarce, expensive, and owned by corporations, those delays become baked into the system. Because the consequences of home ownership or its denial shape more than finances. They shape life choices, relationships, community, identity, generations. This crisis isn't evenly distributed. Some regions are crushed by affordability, others strained by influx, others frozen by zoning laws, others dominated by short-term rentals, others overwhelmed by investor ownership. Gen Z will inherit a housing landscape that changes dramatically depending on where they live. In some cities, home ownership will be nearly impossible. In others, still challenging, but possible with sacrifice. In a few, within reach for now. Because the trend is clear. The forces driving this crisis are spreading, not shrinking. Investors move into markets as soon as they become popular. Remote work expands where once demand was low. Tourism turns neighborhoods into short-term rental zones. Underbuilding persists. Zoning reform inches forward. As long as this continues, the pressure will only build. The imbalance is simple. The system evolves quickly when it benefits those with power. and moves slowly when it comes to helping those without it. A hedge fund can decide to buy hundreds of homes in a week. A city can take 10 years to approve a single apartment building. A cash buyer arrives in minutes. A family might spend months gathering paperwork for a mortgage. An Airbnb operator can flip a home overnight. A city council might debate regulating that conversion for years. The scale is mismatched. The incentives are mismatched. The timeline is mismatched. And young people, first Millennials, now Gen Z, get trapped in the gears of these mismatches. Housing isn't just about supply and demand. It's about power. Who has it? Who doesn't? Who shapes the rules? And who gets shaped by them? But if this is a crisis engineered by decisions, it can be undone by decisions. The path to affordability isn't abstract. It's specific. It's measurable. It's structural. First, we need to build a lot. Not just luxury towers, not just suburban sprawl, but actual housing people can afford. Starter homes, missing middle housing, multifamily units near jobs, near transit, near schools. Cities must legalize density. States must override local resistance, because without more supply, every other fix is just a bandage. Second, we need to protect the housing we already have. Limit how many homes can be owned by institutional investors. Restrict corporate portfolios that hollow out neighborhoods. Incentivize long-term rental stability over short-term tourist extraction. Because homes shouldn't disappear from the market faster than we can build them. Third, we need to realign the incentives. Tax vacant properties. Penalize speculation. Reward local ownership. Create pathways for renters to become owners. Shift the system away from treating housing as a commodity and back toward treating it as shelter. Fourth, we need to modernize the financial system. Rethink mortgage access. Expand down payment assistance. Remove artificial barriers that favor cash buyers over families. Ensure young people aren't penalized for being born in the wrong decade. Fifth, we need national coordination. Because when one city solves affordability, demand just spills into the next. We need policies that match the scale of the problem, not patchwork solutions that push it around. And finally, we need urgency. Not someday, not when it's politically safe. Now. Because the longer we wait, the further affordability slips. Away, not just for Gen Z, but for every generation that follows. Affordable housing isn't a mystery. It's a matter of political will, of prioritizing people over portfolios, communities over quarterly returns, stability over speculation. The system was built by policy. It can be rebuilt by policy, but only if the people shut out of the market have the power to change it. Because affordability isn't a gift, it's a choice, and the window to make that choice is closing. For more content like this, like and subscribe.